ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second edition of our Educational Reform Town Hall meeting. And at this time, to get things started, I'm going to invite Mr. John Goddard to lead us in a word of prayer. Mr. Goddard.
Thank you. Let us bow our heads in prayer. Almighty God and Father, we thank you for the opportunity to meet and discuss matters relating to the education of our children. You assured us through your Son, Jesus Christ, that once we earnestly call upon you, you will respond to us. Be present with us this evening and pour your blessings on the moderator, Dr. Ian Marshall, the presenters, participants in the discussion, and all who are tuned into this session. Inspire us all that what we may say will advance the interests of education and benefit the nation's teachers and children. We thank you, Lord, for the Barbados Union of Teachers, sponsor of this evening's program. Bless its leaders that they may guide the organization in a way that is pleasing to you and beneficial to all. Finally, we pray that by the end of this session, we may be better informed and committed to the task of educating our children. All these things we ask through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Goddard, and welcome again to one and all. And at this time, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the presenters that we have with us this evening. And I'm going to start with, of course, Mr. Alwyn Adams. Now, Mr. Adams is a retired principal. He was born on August 13, 1943. He attended the Coleridge and Parry School from 1955 to 1961. It says he belongs to that ambitious but restless breed of Barbadians of that era who migrated in search of educational opportunities before coming back better prepared to improve the lot of the Barbadian working class. He is a graduate of the Institute of Education, London University, and has a certificate with a merit and a BA honors. He also holds a Master of Science, Educational Management and Supervision from the University of Miami. He is one of the country's most experienced educators, having taught in Barbados, Britain, and the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. His administrative duties included acting deputy principal at St. Paul's Methodist College, Bahamas, and Christchurch Foundation School. He also served as principal of the St. Leonard's Boys School and Coleridge and Parry before retiring in 2007. Mr. Adams was a visiting lecturer at the Regional Police Training Center in Sociology and Effective Communication. He has presented many papers on major educational topics, including core education and the parity of esteem for tech-bought education. He has served as a member of the interviewing panel of the Public Service Commission for the appointment of senior education officers. He's also the author of a paper entitled 50 Years of Education in Barbados in the book Barbados 50 Years of Independence, edited by Sir Trevor Carmichael. As a result of his enlightening contributions to education, Mr. Adams was appointed as one of the Governor General's independent senators for the period 2013 to 2018. He also served as a member of the Church Council of St. James Parish Church. He's also a Justice of the Peace. Dr. Hyacinth Harris. Dr. Hyacinth Harris has enjoyed a career of more than 54 years in education, moving through the ranks from teacher to principal. Prior to becoming a principal, she was assigned as an education officer in the Ministry of Education, Technological and Vocational Training. Dr. Harris's career in educational administration began in 2005 when she was promoted to the post of senior teacher in the primary school system. She has also taught at the tertiary level, having been seconded as a tutor at the Earlison Teachers Training College between 2006 and 2007. She also functioned as an adjunct lecturer at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus for a period of time. In addition to being a certified teacher, Dr. Harris holds a certificate in educational management and administration with distinction from the University of the West Indies, and she also holds a doctorate in educational planning and administration, which she completed at the same university. She's immediate past president of the Association of Public Primary School Principals. She relinquished that post in 2021 and subsequently retired from the public service. Yvette Simmons-Jemmott. Yvette Simmons-Jemmott is a devoted and longstanding member of the Barbados Union of Teachers. She has served in various capacities in the teaching profession, including head of department and deputy principal, both at the secondary level. She is now retired and has remained committed to serving the teaching profession in Barbados through her work with the BUT. Miss Paula-Anne Moore, parent advocate, coordinator, and chief spokesperson for the group of concerned parents of Barbados and the Caribbean Coalition for Exam Redress. Ms. Moore spearheaded the formation of unprecedented coalitions, the group of concerned parents of Barbados and the Caribbean Coalition for Exam Redress in September 2020 in response to the 2020 CXC examination grading crisis, and has acted as their respective leader and spokesperson since inception. She is a mother of 3 active sons, and Ms. Moore notes that the experience of their motherhood and the possession of empathy, voluntarism, and a keen sense and an indefatigable sense of justice are integral part of Mrs. Moore's DNA and all drive for her commitment to student and parent advocacy. In terms of academics, Ms. Moore has an MBA with merit honors in strategic marketing. She also has from Durant University, United Kingdom. She also has a BSc in management study with upper second class honors. And she's a member of the International Association of Business Communicators and was elected a fellow of the UK ISCA, the Corporate Governance Institute, in 2014. Ian Marshall, my namesake. Ian Marshall is a graduate teacher at the primary school and the Barbados Union of Teachers and a steward at the Barbados Union of Teachers. He has taught both formally and informally for over 20 years from nursery level to upper secondary. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree honors and a Master's of Arts in History from the University of the West Indies, Cape Hill. He has been an assistant examiner for the CXC for close to 10 years. He's an avid reader, an exercise enthusiast, a Pan-Africanist, a farmer, and a social activist. Tara Durant. Tara Durant has been a teacher for over a decade. She prides herself as a culturally diverse individual, and this has enriched her experiences in teaching. In addition to her local teaching experience, she has taught internationally, spending 3 years in Japan, teaching at the primary, secondary, and special needs levels. Currently, Tara teaches at a special needs school where she is the information technology coordinator. She has a Master of Science degree in e-commerce and an honors Bachelor of Arts degree in digital enterprise management. She is devoted to the educational, social, and emotional development of children in Barbados. A passion for trade unionism is one of her hallmarks, having been raised by a founding member of the Barbados Union of Teachers and the Barbados Teachers Credit Union. And she's currently an executive member of the Barbados Union of Teachers. So ladies and gentlemen, we have an exciting and well-qualified panel to speak to you this evening. And at this time, I'm going to invite our President, Rudy Lovell, to bring his welcome remarks. President Lovell, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marshall. A pleasant good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rudy Lovell, and I'm the president of the Barbados Union of Teachers. It is a great pleasure to welcome you to the Barbados Union of Teachers' second virtual town hall meeting. If our last town hall meeting held on the 10th of June 2022 is anything to judge by, you are in for an exciting and engaging conversation concerning education reform in Barbados. To date, there are only 3 things that the public has been told thus far. There's a plan to abolish the Barbados Secondary Schools Entrance Examination, number 1. Number 2, there's a plan to implement junior academies. And number 3, there's a plan to implement schools of excellence. These 3 areas will be the focus of this evening's discussion, along with the implications of each. While we all may agree that there's a need for reform, the reasons for reform may vary from person to person. Nevertheless, I am sure that this evening's discussion will provide several reasons why we may need education reform in Barbados. With these brief remarks, I now return the virtual lectern to the moderator, Dr. Ian Marshall. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President, for those brief remarks. And as just to give you a snapshot of how we expect this meeting to go this evening, remember we're going to be having 2 10-minute presentations. Then we'll have a question time, and it will follow that sequence for the rest of the meeting. Just a few reminders. Of course, you are free to agree and disagree as you are wont. And all we ask is that you do so in a respectful manner. As usual, the practice is that you will raise your hand during the time of questions and answers, and I will recognize you and I will give you the floor. So without any further ado, I now invite Mr. Alwyn Adams, our first presenter, to speak to you. Mr. Adams, over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. I am operating from here, but I'm not getting host.
Mr. President, could you give Mr. Adams hosting privileges so he can upload his PowerPoint? We are hearing you well, though.
Check Mr. Adams again to see if you have been granted the privileges. Mr. Adams?
Yes.
So you're ready to go there, Mr. Adams? Yes, we are seeing you. You have shared your screen. Okay, Mr. Adams, your 10 minutes start now.
Get in some trouble. Oh, whatever. All right, I'll go ahead from what I have. There's a consensus among experts as well as international agencies that education is the major force to bring about social and economic development among developing countries. 3 persons I want to mention here. One is Dr. Hassan from the ILO, the UNESCO, and the World Bank have all been agreed on this issue. So education planners in Barbados should wake up to the stark reality that the education system, which we inherited from our colonizers, was designed A, to preserve British rule, 2, to inculcate psychological dependency on its victims, and 3, to suppress local values and culture, and really had nothing much at all to do with the social and economic development of Barbados. An examination of the grammar school curriculum point to the very narrow academic subjects, as well as the inclusion of TVET subjects on the grounds that classical scholars did not deem anything practical to be of educational value. This level of colonial overlordship was utilized by Mr. John Hammond, headmaster of Harrison's College, in his 1950 speech day address, when he issued a stern warning to the authorities that prestigious subjects such as Latin and Greek should not be discontinued to introduce modern technical subjects. His concern, of course, was to maintain the status quo, and obviously had no intention of linking the school's curriculum with the manpower needs of Barbados. It was this snobbish, condescending attitude of the powerful grammar school lobby that caused technical subjects to be kept off the curriculum in Barbados until 1962. And even then, TVET was regarded as low status, and as a result, up to this day, is fighting for parity of esteem. The powerful grammar schools lobby, with help from allies in high places, creamed off the academically inclined students at 11, and the low achievers were deemed fit for TVET, and most of them sent to secondary modern schools. In the end, to be stigmatized by their peers and to a large extent by the wider society. I must tell you as well that many schools in Barbados refused to include woodwork and metalwork marks in the end of term report card averages because they said, obviously, it was not education. There was too no provision in Barbados until relatively recently for industrial arts teachers to gain degrees, just putting them at a disadvantage with their peers. Every attempt to bring about equality between academics and technical vocational subjects, or between grammar schools and secondary modern schools, was stoutly resisted. A standard argument was that with the 11+, everyone now had equal access, and that at any rate, we in Barbados were outperforming our CARICOM neighbors. But I want to make this point that our neighbors are no longer just among the CARICOM countries, but also the tigers of Southeast Asia and elsewhere. But while we were basking in the glory of our past achievements, those countries had already gone ahead and integrated TVET as integral parts of their educational system to fit into their national development plan. So we are in danger, we are behind now and are in danger of falling further behind unless we urgently reform our educational system, that our students will be able to acquire the skills to compete with the best in the world. Indeed, our efforts to fashion a new sustainable development plan is being stymied by the defenders of an educational system that is colonial in origin, orientation, and outlook, and out of sync with demands of the modern technological age. No wonder then that there was bitter opposition by grammar schools lobby to the opening of the Barbados Community College. Charlie Best, the first principal of the college, had this to say about what he termed the liberal arts traditionalists of this country. They exhibited, he said, an undiminished reluctance to concede that there were worthwhile value in such activities as manpower education, maintaining to the end that a literary education was all a student needed to get on in this world. Mr. Best then alluded to the fact that the Barbados government was spending huge sums of money on education, and still nearly all the engineering technicians and many of the middle-level technicians at Cable and Wireless, Light and Power, and the telephone company were imported from Britain and Canada. Even pan boilers in the sugar industry came from Guyana. We find as well that in the 1993 address by Minister of Education Keith Simmons, addressing a regional conference here in Barbados, he declared that the #1 problem in this country and in the Caribbean was youth unemployment. He blamed our schools for failing consistently to supply adequate number of students with marketable skills. He lamented the fact that technical subjects took second place on the curriculum, and that children who pursued TechVault were looked down on and shunned by their academic peers. Similar views were echoed in a background paper prepared by the Ministry of Education in 1992. This paper conceded that the 11+ continues to have a negative impact on the newer secondary schools. But what is even more serious was the long-term psychological damage it inflicted on students, especially boys. In addition, a circular sent from the Ministry of Finance in January 2006 pointed out that Barbados has been experiencing a deficit in the artisan trades and in nursing and other important skills. A pre-technical program was proposed and 6 schools were earmarked to start the pilot program. This program was expected to produce 150 artisans per year, and I have personally not heard of any success in that regard. Claims about equality in education ring hollow when, despite universal access to secondary school, the majority of our children leave without certification or marketable skills. The white paper estimates this to be over 70%. Those children are not benefiting from the education system in the same manner as the academically inclined group, as emphasis from equity of access should move on to equity of outcome. The
You
ILO
have 3 more minutes, 3 more
ILO
minutes.
expert, Dr. Hassan, Hassan, in delivering TVEC's Council's 20th anniversary lecture in Barbados, concluded that our education system in present form does not adequately prepare our students for the world of work, and recommended integrating TVEC with mainstream subjects to make it more attractive. Professor Andrew Downs, in an address to Erdison College in 2015, also decried the system of transfer and called for urgent reform of the system. Warren Smith mentioned similar sentiments, and he compares our effort with that of the Pacific Rim countries and concluded that we are not getting the bang for the buck. A developed country like Barbados cannot afford to treat education as a social service, i.e. for its own sake, but as an investment for Barbadians will not begrudge money spent on education if they can enjoy the returns on their investments. And finally, 2 recent commissions concluded that failure in the educational system breeds failure in the economic and the social systems. The authors concluded with the cries of the children themselves about an education system which seemed to have thrown them in large measure to the wolves. For example, the children complained about the public negative perception of certain low status and bad schools based on the low marks earned in the 11+, indicating that public perception persisted whatever success the school or themselves achieved, describing it as akin to suffering from the "can anything good come out of Nazareth" syndrome. This perception is internalized by the student population and inflicts irreparable damage to their psyche. They also alluded to the fact that it's started in the primary schools and followed them into the secondary schools. The inequality creates a self-fulfilling prophecy for a very large section of our young human resource sector, resulting in enormous psychological burden too heavy for young citizens to bear. Our children cannot progress in a highly competitive technological world unless the pillars of an outmoded educational system are disbanded. The message is clear. Reform is both inevitable and imperative. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. I now invite Dr. Hyacinth Harris to give her presentation. Dr. Harris, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. Good evening, everyone. My presentation looks at the abolition of the Barbados Secondary Schools entrance examination and the possible implications. Now, the presentation will focus primarily on the school community and I will look specifically at the students, the teachers, and the principals. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, let me emphasize that assessment is absolutely necessary in teaching and learning. Its purpose really is to gather relevant information about student performance or progress, or to determine student interest to make judgments about their learning. As such, it allows for evaluation, which is in fact the application of qualitative statements to the data that emerges from assessments. Therefore, it is naturally expected that some action will occur as a result of assessing students. As a reminder, let me briefly refer to formative and summative assessments. Formative assessments encompass a whole host of tools that provide feedback to teachers or students with the aim of helping the students learn more effectively. The primary role is therefore to diagnose deficiencies and to inform teaching. Conversely, summative assessments are generally high-stakes assessments that are used to get a final determination of how much learning has taken place. That is, how much does a student know? As posited by Elmer et al. 2019, summative assessments focus on making comparisons and selections. So the Barbados Secondary Schools Entrance Examination fits squarely and singly in the realm of summative assessments. The BSSEE is a high-stakes, large-scale summative assessment that commands the attention of all involved in education, and it demands accountability from teachers, school leaders, and the students. And even though, as many individuals have argued, there is nothing implicitly wrong with the test itself, I dare say that its abolition can have some positive effects on the school community, as the associated commercialism will hardly be given the prominence that currently obtains. So let's look at the implications of abolishing this exam for students. We have been reportedly told of the proposed abolition, so therefore it is logical to make a decision regarding an alternative assessment strategy. It is important to note that in making any decision regarding the replacement for the common entrance, as we commonly call it, a significant amount of consideration must be given to the students. To date, the public is unaware of what the alternative will be and which cohort of students will first be affected. Clearly, the lack of publicized information, even as we approach the close of the Common Entrance 2022, would suggest that it would be disingenuous to impose any new assessment approach on the next cohort of Class 4 students. Despite this situation, it is also important to understand that there are some implicit possibilities with the abolition of the exam. One area that we can look at is the reduction of stress and anxiety for students. As it is, there are many cultural factors that emanate from this examination and tend to produce lots of unnecessary mental and physical stress for our 10 to 11-year-old children. Parents, teachers, other education officials, the media, the general public perpetuate the need for children to achieve in the higher percentile ranges so that they can attend the quote unquote good schools. As all students strive to meet the demands of the exam, we find that very little acknowledgement, if any, is given to the degree of effort that the lower performing students try to exercise in order to meet the demands that are placed on them with this examination. And I would also say that very little acknowledgement is given to those students who have been able to increase their scores over time. So we engage in making comparisons from student to student and from school to school. A different strategy of assessment is likely to reduce the high level of anxiety and stress that are associated with the common entrance exam. We need to look at the possibility of greater attention to student needs. With a different format, there is this potential. Early detection of weaknesses will certainly be critical, and appropriate measures would need to be implemented to address the identified weaknesses. Schools working in collaboration with other stakeholders should be able to help students find their niche, and the current standardized solely summative test would not be the sole judgment of a student's ability. When we look at the implications for teachers, certainly there's likely to be less emphasis on teaching to the test. This is the practice of devoting extra time and attention in the classroom to the skills and knowledge that will be assessed on a national test. As it is, many teachers who prepare students for the common entrance often prefer to relegate the sciences and the social studies to the background and focus solely on mathematics and language arts with all its components. Now, this really is a disservice to the students, especially in an era when we are grappling with several socio-cultural issues. It is important that students not only understand math and language arts content, it is also important, and I would say extremely so, that they be exposed to citizenship skills. Subjects such as social studies offer this exposure. Science does as well. With a different approach to assessment, it's quite likely that teachers will not feel pressured to prepare students for a one-shot examination, and they will focus on depth rather than breadth. With the new format, there's also the likelihood of teachers being more involved in using formal structures to diagnose and remediate weaknesses before they become entrenched. I'd also say that ongoing professional development for teachers is quite likely. And this professional development should emphasize how to interpret and execute the established national curriculum with all of the alternative assessment strategies that may be implemented. Teachers would also need to know how to utilize pertinent data on student performance that will certainly emerge from the assessments. Now, this data should follow the students to the next level of their education, and this will allow for a level of continuity as they transition from primary school. The data should also be used by the educators at the higher level to continue to meet the needs of the students.
3 more minutes.
With regard to the principals, there are also some very apparent implications. Certainly, principals will need to give greater attention to instructional leadership. They will need to devote more time to understand policies that are articulated by the Ministry of Education. Additionally, they should be equipped with the requisite skills and knowledge, either aid teachers or assign curriculum teams to help with the interpretation and the execution of the curriculum and all the accompanying assessments. School organization will be extremely critical, as principals will definitely need to put structures in place that will enable students to explore their interests and will also enable teachers to fashion their teaching accordingly. Principals must ensure that they are familiar with the teacher's skills and must be willing to assign teachers strategically to meet students' needs while ensuring that the teaching and learning takes into consideration the approach that will be used for assessment. This would mean that provision should be made for principals at the primary school level to indicate the planned programs for their schools and the accompanying needs. In this way, a more meaningful process could be used to allocate adequate funds and staff for each primary school. This would also mean that the ad hoc manner in which teachers are sometimes transferred from one school to another would definitely need to be addressed and discontinued. A better approach would be to make reference to the local school needs through the principals. Principals would definitely need to be exposed to professional development in a very comprehensive manner. And I say that while all novice principals should be afforded formal exposure to policy and leadership skills as part of their preparation for the post, all principals should be expected to engage periodically in ongoing professional development as they strive to execute their duties. Training can occur either locally or internationally via online programs, but principals at all levels should have a good understanding of the strategies that are needed for data collection and interpretation, and they should be able to use the data that is collated from any assessments to inform programs which will be designed to benefit the students and by extension, the school. So generally,
30 seconds.
Human and physical resources must not be overlooked. There may certainly be the need to increase teacher population, and without doubt, all individuals operating in the school community would definitely require easy access to the materials that will aid them in functioning effectively and efficiently under a new assessment strategy. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. And at this time, we're going to open the floor. And I see that John has opened the button. So I'm going to invite Mr. Goddard to ask his question. And please direct your question to one of the two presenters. Go ahead, Mr.
Yes.
Goddard.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I've been accustomed to opening the button all my life. Now, let me first of all congratulate both Alwyn, my good friend Alwyn, and her name is
Dr. Hyacinth Harris.
Dr. Paris, for excellent presentation. The question which I want not teachers to answer as we look at this subject of the common entrance examination have we ever examined what educational purpose the exam serves? I have challenged many a person to tell me what educational value it has. And I hear a lot about social value. You need some students to be part of an elite group and that kind of thing. Every society has elitism built into it and these kinds of things. And in fact, somebody even responded to me on Facebook by saying that a society needs at least 20% of its people to be in charge. And then the other 80% can be like servants. The master-servant relationship which Alwyn spoke about. So I want all the members in the audience and on the panel this evening to respond to that question. They don't have to say it openly here, but to think about it. What educational value does the common entrance examination serve? Because we as teachers, educators should be interested in the educational value of anything we do.
Okay, well, I will ask thank you, Mr. Goddard. I'm going to ask Mr. Adams to respond to you first. I'm going to invite Dr. Harris to respond to you afterwards.
Right.
So
remember I said I place emphasis on educational value.
Yes, we heard you. Thank you. Yes,
Right.
Mr. Adams, educational value. What is the question on the floor? I think you are still muted, Mr. Adams. All right, Dr. Harris, you want to go in the interim?
Yes.
Oh, Mr. Adams is here now. Yeah, he chimed in. Thank you, Mr. Adams.
No, it was Gladstone Holder who said in one of his columns years ago that that 11+ test was never educationally justifiable, and that it was a matter of following pattern as opposed to having what Mr. Goddard called educational value. Now, one of the points that I have never heard, I've never been, lucky to hear mentioned, is that the test itself was a fraud. I mentioned that last time, and I just want to spend a minute or so on it. That test came about as a result of a hereditarian psychologist who claimed that he had found the holy grail of intelligence and that it was over 75% hereditary and that it was fixed and that it could not be changed, whatever you do. And although it is claimed in Barbados that it has no predictive value, the real purpose of it is in fact to predict what children, according to their scores and the 11+, will do at 16 and 18. And it has been proven to be a monumental failure. The research was concocted. The author has been discredited. And as a result of that, and the fact that it has no real educational value, that is the reason why it was abolished in the United Kingdom.
Mr. Adams, can you pause there for a moment? Let me see if Dr. Harris wants to counter or to agree with what you are saying, because you are saying it has no educational value. Dr. Harris, what is your view?
Dr. Marshall and all others in the audience, let me say that, as I said on the last occasion in the first town hall meeting, the common entrance exam, as it is currently structured, is a placement exam. In other words, it is designed to test what students know at 11 years old or 10 years old, depending on when they take the exam. And the scores that they achieved are used to determine which schools, which secondary schools they will attend. So I don't know that we need to debate whether it is educationally sound or not, because we must use assessments. And if we use another form of assessing the students, if we use a different strategy for assessing the students, the content will be the same. The topics that we will test will be the same. The focus, I believe, needs to be on helping those students who are not what we call high flyers, those students who are not in the higher percentile range, those students that we do not speak about every year when this exam is finished and the results are returned. Because oftentimes we speak only about those top 10 students, and we hardly ever recognize the students who have moved their scores from 20% to 50%. And I'm saying that the students need to be, those students in the lower end need to be recognized for their effort. Systems need to be put in place to help them to improve in the areas in which they are weak. So whatever assessment we use, the content is still going to be the same. What we have to look at is the purpose of the assessment.
Well, thank you, Dr. Harris. What Dr. Harris is suggesting is that if you want to quibble over the word, she's saying that it has a placement value. Whether you define that as being of educational value is another matter. Anybody else wants to weigh in on this or any other question for that matter? We have 15 minutes for this segment. Any other questions or comments?
I just want to say very quickly that
Certainly, Mr. Adams.
A child's life chances are predicated on that test. And reputable educators have found, certainly in the United Kingdom, that between 20 and 10 and 20%, when it was done in the United Kingdom, that those children were misplaced. And that the middle class children always had a better chance of getting into what would be the grammar schools than the working class child. And this same thing is happening in Barbados. Because in 1969, there were over 10,000 children sitting that exam for 750 places in grammar schools. They didn't say that there were places in other schools. So they weren't competing for places in other schools, they were competing for places in the grammar school. And in that very year, there had to be a 3-day debate in the House of Assembly because of interference with the marks inside the Ministry of Education.
All right, Mr. Adams, stick a pin there, stick a pin there for a minute. I see Ishan has, sorry, I don't know if it is male or female, but a person has, the name is Ishan, that person has a hand up. I'm inviting them to weigh in at this time. I'm coming back to you shortly, Mr. Adams. The floor is yours. Yes.
Moderator, Dr. Marshall, I thank you for the opportunity to speak in this very celebrated audience that we have before us today. And I commend each and every one on their contributions. It's something that I'm quite enjoying. My question is not related to the 11 plus. You invited us to bring up any other topic that we may want to. I am currently in the country of Tanzania. And in this country, they speak a language called Swahili. And they speak this language all across the continental African landscape. For me, the educational system in Barbados, which I went through, it fails to recognize any African language as a viable aspect of their curricula. And I find that the Eurocentric focus of the, especially the languages in the arts, language arts, I think it has done a discredit to us as a people of African ancestry. And I think that the educational system should be pivoted towards a more African-oriented curriculum. If you look at the fact that they are now looking at direct flights to perhaps Ghana and Kenya from the Caribbean region, if you're looking at the fact that the diaspora, as it is called, is now considered the 6th district of the African Union, if you're looking at the fact that there is already a flag representing diaspora, you will find it that I would find it a bit irresponsible to continue with this English, French, Spanish, European focus in teaching. I've already sent recommendations to the Ministry of Education in Barbados. I've left notes with the Prime Minister in regards to this particular aspect. And at this time, I would like to invite the teachers present to give their perspective on the introduction of an African language into the curriculum of the Caribbean and the CXC program in particular.
Okay, thank you for your challenge. I'm going to invite Ian Marshall, my namesake, to bring his question as well. If he wants to respond to you first and then bring his own, that's quite fine.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm glad the brother raised that particular point because this is a pet peeve of mine. I have been wondering for years, why is it that we teach foreign languages, which are mainly Eurocentric languages, even in primary school, they do Spanish. When you get in secondary school, is French. And then we go up to the other levels, and we're now introducing Mandarin Chinese at some levels. And with a country that's 95% Black, we have no African languages to fall back on within our school system. And I think is preposterous. I think it is completely ridiculous. What we are going to show as we go through our presentation later on, we're going to look at curriculum reform, and it is necessary. I deem it absolutely necessary that students gain skills at the lower level. We too often underestimate students thinking that they cannot handle or deal with the more complex issues that other jurisdictions may be dealing with. And I think that language, something like Yoruba, which is something that's very common, especially now in a more, and it's coming wrong now in a more religious focus, that can be taught at the lower levels. I see no reason why it can't. So I'm glad that you raised that point, sir. And that is something that we really need to focus on.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Any other feedback or any other question you want to raise?
Well, I would just like to say that I would agree with what has been said, and with the suggestion as well. You have to understand, though, that we came out of a system which it was really indoctrination. I want to just give an example that I have been to 2 primary schools and the Cordron Parish School, and I cannot remember ever singing a local Barbadian or West Indian song or poem, or ever reading a Caribbean author or Caribbean history. The history that I know I actually got in London. So something would have to be wrong. And in fact, George Lamin wrote his book in 1953. And we did work, literature books from Scotland, All Mortality and a lot of nonsense. And I came back to Barbados in 1980. I was involved in the Books King, and then I was principal. And I never saw Lamin book being put on the list of any of the schools I was at. I was at St. James, Foundation, St. Leonard's, and Cordron Parish. And that book was written in 1953. And it is saying that there's a level of self-hate. And it's not going to be easy for us to get the ministry, but I feel it might not be easy to get the ministry to include either Yoruba or the other language that was mentioned. But I would certainly be in favor of it, because for too long, we have been subject to this kind of indoctrination. And I want to just say one other thing, that you will notice that it is the defenders of the English system that is against taking over our education and indicating that we are not able of changing it. how can we be so educated and we cannot change our education? We really need to get cracking. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. And I see Dr. Harris. She has her hand raised. But before you go, Dr. Harris, I saw Mr. Goddard. He also had a hand. So after Mr. Goddard, then Dr. Harris. Mr. Goddard?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I was so pleased to hear that gentleman talk about teaching an African language in our school system. You know, as Alwyn said, in my own school life, I was not, you know that I did not do West Indian history until I reached university. You know what I mean? I did British history from 55 BC to 1939, the beginning of the World War. I did American history. You're laughing, but I'm serious. And nothing. And to talk about West Indian literature. Wait, we didn't even realize that I had a West Indian literature. I mean, I did Milton, Shakespeare.
It's terrible.
All kinds of names that I don't even want to remember now. And I was well versed in them. And those, but nothing at all about West Indians. Nothing about us. It is as though we didn't exist at all. So I'm not surprised that we don't want to acknowledge that Africa exists either. You know, and so Swahili, Yoruba, I would favor them 1000%.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Goddard. I'm going to invite Dr. Harris to speak, and then I see Paula-Anne, her hand is raised. So after Dr. Harris, will be Paula-Anne, and then we will go to our second segment because we're running out of time. Go, Dr. Harris. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Marshall. I just want to say that it is fine for us to look at the historical aspect of education, and that can help to inform how we move forward. I'd also like to say that subjects like social studies give the opportunity to introduce languages from Africa. I remember a few years ago that we embraced what was called the Peace Program, which allowed for the arts to operate in the schools. And I know that in the social studies especially, there have been student teachers who have utilized languages like Swahili and Yoruba, especially around the time of African Awareness Month. As we go forward, though, we have to realize that the reform in education will not only be restricted to the common entrance exam, but we also have to think about the curriculum. And certainly, if we are thinking about the curriculum, here is the possibility for including languages from Africa or from anywhere else where Barbados is making an impact, so that our students are not isolated from what is happening in the global environment.
Excellent point. Paula-Anne, over to you. You'll be the final comment or question. Paula-Anne?
Yes, good evening, everyone. The presentations have been very informative and to the usual high standard we've come to expect. Just to offer a different perspective, perhaps generationally wise, to the comments as to our education system and the colonial influence previously, and bringing it to the current situation. My education, my era, we were the first where CXC was introduced. I believe it was CXC Maths when I was in 4th form. And I kind of straddled the transition between a more Caribbean-centric education. I did some London and Cambridge and some CXC. And I enjoyed that because I had both a regional local perspective as it related to history and to a lesser extent, English Lit. We have 3 boys, 21, 19, and 15. And I think we have to make sure that in our imperative to have a more culturally relevant education. We do not go too far east to become west, i.e., what I am finding, for example, all three of my boys did history up to CXC CSET level. What concerns me is all three of my boys, in terms of the history syllabi, it was only Caribbean, South American, a limited American history. I find at the end of the day, we are a tiny region. We are part of a global village. And what concerns me is that there's not a component of our history syllabus that introduces our children to, for example, the formation of the UN, what happened in China, how Israel was formed, how Europe undeveloped Africa. My concern is that we have to ensure that we marry both the desire to ensure we have a culturally relevant education system, that we also make sure that our children have a broad-based education as it relates to both literature and history. And I would also say that currently the children are exposed to a wide depth of culturally relevant, largely Caribbean-based literature. So I'm just making the point that we have improved the cultural relevance of various components of our education system. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Paula-Anne. And at this time, we're going to segue now to the second part, which deals with, sorry. So I'm going to invite Mrs. Yvette Simmons-Jemmott to give her presentation. So Mrs. Simmons-Jemmott, over to you, please.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. Is my screen? My main we encountered on our determination to create middle schools in our environment. I will make reference to the experience of and the studies done in the USA, Bermuda, and Trinidad and Tobago to establish parallels between their experiences and our expected outcomes. We have on the screen what was told to us by the Director of Reform, Dr. Ida May-Denny. I'm going to be charitable and say that that information has been sketchy. And that is the only information that we have been given, that there will be junior academies at the lower school level and academies of excellence at the upper school level. But should there be a stated reason or rationale for such a creation? Middle schools were established in the US because it was felt that the needs of the adolescent were being somewhat ignored. So students in those schools were allowed more freedom, there was ready access to support services, and lesser emphasis on academic subjects. In Bermuda, middle schools were introduced as a result of the decision to abolish their entrance examination. One feels that that might be the reason for its promotion here. It is worth noting, though, that Bermuda has since decided to reverse its decision on middle schools. That alarming statement was made after the results of research done in the US were published. Districts in New York concluded that middle schools are not the best way to educate students, and that students who enter public middle schools fall behind their peers in normal schools. That same result was found in a comprehensive study done in Bermuda. That is, that middle schoolers fell behind their peers in normal schools, and that the average reading standard of Bermudian students after 1 year in the middle school was lower than at the end of primary school. I ask the question, therefore, is there anything so inherently different about Barbados or Barbadian students that would make us feel confident that we would achieve different results? What will be the school role of these junior academies? How large will they be? Right now, we have schools of over 1,000. Will these schools comprise 800 students or more? It should be noted that the recommended role for middle schools is 500 students. Were we to follow this sage recommendation, we would have to build more schools, and we all know the likelihood of that. So, the proposal of junior academies is intending that 11 to 14-year-olds alone will be resident at these schools. It is well known that students in that age group tend to be more likely to engage in antisocial behavior. This is seen especially in second and third formers, who at that stage are trying to establish their own identity. Indeed, one US commentator dubbed it as hormones flying all over the place. Schools therefore depend on their fifth and sixth formers particularly to help maintain order and to preserve the traditions of the school. Because of the high concentration of adolescents, as I've said before, in one place, you will have increased antisocial behavior. Again, in studies done in the US, Bermuda, and Trinidad and Tobago, that fact was highlighted. And I refer particularly to a review done in 2007 in Bermuda, which included all the schools in Bermuda, and a study done by Antoine Ali in Trinidad, which looked at the junior secondary, our own, well, what is normally called the middle school. Middle schooling will require students to transition to a different type of school. These students would have transitioned from primary to middle school and would have formed relationships with teachers, would have settled into a new culture, and then they're being forced to make a second transition just as they're about to sit their CSEC examinations. We recognize the difficulty of the transition from primary to secondary, with guidance counselors offering advice and support for these students. We've had camps dedicated to the trauma that can attend this transitioning. How could we therefore countenance another transition coming at a time that the student should be focusing on his CXC examinations? I've already alluded to this disruption of established school culture by not having the senior school present. But whatever school is chosen as a middle school would have had an established culture. Should that culture not be maintained? And what about the names of schools? It may seem like a simple, perhaps silly point, but will those names be changed? Especially if established older secondary schools should now become middle schools? In the 70s and 80s, a lot of research was done on the effect of teacher satisfaction to school improvement. It was clear that when teachers were satisfied, the school was more productive and effective. Teachers at secondary schools tend not to want to teach exclusively in the junior section of the secondary school. There could well then be the circumstance of a majority of teachers in a junior academy totally upset at their change of employment, so to speak. We've already looked at the fact that second and third formers tend to be the most disruptive. Would teachers thus prefer this type of assignment? The move to junior academies will require a massive reallocation of teachers. We may well remember the reallocation of teachers from one secondary school to the 20 other schools and the resultant disorder and confusion. Now we're going to need to move teachers from all 21 secondary schools. If the reallocation from one school proved to be so difficult, why would we assume that this widespread reallocation would be seamless? Additionally, there are subjects that are only done in the senior section of the school, but these subjects are done at almost every secondary school. For example, business studies. Where will these teachers go if their school has now been named as a junior academy? Most schools start their CXC program in some subjects in third form. Will that practice now be discontinued? And if it does continue, will all schools be following the same program or the same topics of a wide syllabus? And how will such be done? What will happen to the child who's passed for a school that is designated a school of excellence and is now in second form? Where will that child go? Or conversely, the student who is in fifth form at a school that is now designated a middle school. Can a school be both a junior academy and a school of excellence? Common sense would tell us no. Given the number of concerns addressed, and knowing that these could not be the finite number of challenges, as I've merely scratched the surface, shouldn't we have a discussion with our affected partners before we attempt such a reform, which sounds as if it will be chaotic? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simmons-Jemmott. Some very searching questions, and we'll come back to those a bit later. At this time, I'm going to invite Paula-Anne Moore to give her presentation. Paula-Anne?
Good evening, fellow committee members, everyone in attendance. Thank you again for this excellent opportunity to continue this dialogue. And I am very grateful and appreciative of the opportunity as a parent to comment. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Just to give an overview, we did say in the bio that I am a representative, the coordinator of the group of concerned parents of Barbados and the Caribbean Coalition for Exam Redress. Those entities coalesced out of the 2022 exam crisis, and we've continued our advocacy on behalf of the children regarding CXC ongoing challenges during the pandemic. We look forward to eventually forming a more permanent basis and a more permanent entity to advocate on national issues and regional issues relating to education. Next slide, please. Again, you've had the bio. I know I've had a lot of comment and question as to who I am and why do I have any need or value to comment on with regard to education. Obviously, I don't have an education background in terms of profession, but I would reiterate that as a parent, regardless of whether I have a master's background as I do, or not, any parent, regardless of their education level or business level, has the value and the right to advocate and be interested in their children's education and its future. Next slide, please. Again, I won't go through that detail, but I would reiterate that over the last nearly 3 years since the CXC grading crisis in 2020, we have been pleased working with our student advocate, Khalil Kostawala, and other students and other parents and education stakeholders, that parents have been afforded a seat at the table as it relates to the Barbados Union of Teachers. I was invited to sit on their education reform committee, the Caribbean Union of Teachers, the Caribbean Association of Principals, and a wide range of media appearances nationally, regionally, and internationally to continue to hold CXC and our education authorities nationally and regionally to hold their feet to the fire to ensure that the student voices are heard. Thank you. Next slide, please. Now, just to dwell on the meat of the matter, I know that I was invited to present on focusing on the 11+ and from a parental perspective, but if I crave your indulgence to address this a bit differently, I think you need to begin with the end in mind. What are we trying to achieve exactly with education reform? I think all of us can agree that the whole point of education, an education system, is to ensure that whatever the talent of our children might be, that it's maximized optimally and that the education system gives them the opportunity to do so. I would say that what I found since I became involved in this endeavor in terms of parent advocacy is that all too often the parental perspective is ignored. We hear CXC talking, for example, about engaging education stakeholders, but seldom, if or rarely, are parents mentioned and students even less so. I would also proffer that parents need to voice their concerns. Far too often when I raise the issue, I get the feedback that parents have concerns, but they are afraid to be visible because they fear victimization. So really, I think the onus is on parents. If we want to advocate for our children, we need to recognize that there's power and strength in numbers to get the education authorities to pay attention to our concerns. And frankly, we need to open our mouth more. What I would say is, in terms of what I bring to the table, is that I've had a certain extensive degree of international business experience, whether it be from Southeast Asia or internationally. And what is always at the forefront of that experience is application of best practice. And I think oftentimes there is a reluctance to apply a business perspective to education. And certainly that relates to education reform. If we are pursuing something as radical and as transformational and as fundamental as the education reform that has been identified thus far, and of course we all await further details, we have to ensure that any implementation is done utilizing best practice as it relates to any implementation of a fundamental change. And there are myriad aspects of that in terms of change management, And a key part of that is stakeholder engagement. Project management, you have to ensure that you have a best lead time. And also you need to identify your resources. Are we matching what we're trying to achieve? All the examples that we have been given thus far of the middle schools and Academy of Excellence, which would require a transformational change to our structure, that has to be married to both the culture of Barbados and also there's a dollar value to that. And there is such a thing as implementation deficit disorder. And I won't list on the table the number of changes that we have put in place of late and the myriad challenges that have related thereto. And education is so fundamental to our society. It affects all of us. We cannot afford to get it right. I'm sorry, get it wrong. I would also say that before we even leap to middle schools and Academy of Excellence and abolishing the 11+, we have to begin with the end in mind. What are we trying to achieve? What is the strategic plan? Have we married this end result that has been given to us thus far, the information we've been given thus far, is it really adequately married to our strengths, our weaknesses, our opportunities, and our threats? Is it something that we should look at, and in terms of us proposing what we think is realistic, should we not look at education reform, but within the existing parameters of the current structure that we have in place in terms of primary schools and secondary schools? And as identified before, we have CXCs that you have to plan for. And my concern is that the Academy of Excellence and the middle schools that have been discussed so far, those might be more relevant to another culture and another system, but less relevant to us as well. I will touch on the 11+ at this point to say that that is a very popular punching bag / effigy that a lot of us want to burn. And it is well acknowledged that there are major deficiencies as it relates to the 11+. But my comment is that that is one fundamental component, the transition between primary and secondary school, but we have to look at certain deficiencies that I don't hear as many people talking about in terms of identifying early and optimally children that are differently abled, that need remedial help in primary school, so that at the age of 10, 11, they're not scoring 0 to 30%. And how are we managing those children so that when they leave school, they have requisite skill sets or training that best suits their skill set? So therefore, education reform needs to start from the bottom up. I would also quickly take the opportunity to say that education reform is not just limited to our national situation. We also have to address what is happening with CXC. Prior Minister of Education Bradshaw endorsed our view that there needs to be a change in the corporate governance of CXC. The pandemic environment has demonstrated that there needs to be a radical change in terms of ensuring that they adhere to best practice. And we do think that there's a need for an independent external regulator that sits between CARICOM and COSOD and CXC. They're showing a lack of responsiveness, and it's to our children's detriment. We have a great commitment and respect for the heritage and legacy of CXC, but it can do better, and we are constructively trying to ensure that that is optimized. Next slide, please.
Your time is, you can just make your closing statement, Paula-Anne.
Yes, as you can see from the slide, if we don't get this right, what is at stake? And again, from a parental perspective, we cannot afford to that if it's not done properly. Education reform, destabilization of the education system is possibility, and we don't want parental confidence and trust to be lost in the system, so that and which may lead to the privatization of the secondary school system particularly, and we would hate to end up with a two-tier system, which we are trying to avoid, so that the 1% goes to private school, and that is obviously not what we're trying to achieve in our system. So with that, next slide, please. I just want to thank for the opportunity. Next slide, please. The future of our children are at stake, and I look forward to working with education stakeholders to ensure that, that education reform includes and involves maximal stakeholder engagement, including parents and students, and that our voices are heard. And I just want to close by thanking the BUT on this proactive, dynamic initiative. And I think we're taking the bull by the horns and forcing dialogue and interaction and communication and debate, and there can only be a benefit going forward. So I thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you. And we're gonna move to questions. And I see Mr. Goddard has his hand up again. He said he's accustomed to opening the bat. But before he comes to bat, I just want to ask one question to challenge your minds before we go to Mr. Goddard, and it is this: for all we have heard thus far, I have not heard anyone from within the Ministry of Education or even from the political directorate say to us clearly that there's a rationale behind why they're doing what they're doing, and secondly, whether what they are proposing will address the deficiencies that we have currently in the system. And that, to my mind, is the real question, because it does not matter what system you put in place. If it is built on the same faulty foundation, you're going to have a repeat of what we're having now, which is the continuation of elitism, the them and those and them, and that whole dynamic will still be at play. So those, to my mind, are the real questions that need to be answered. Is there a correlation between what the deficiencies we are seeing now and what you're introducing, and whether those things will have the capacity to bring change in those critical areas? Mr. Goddard, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and you touched on something which I was going to raise. But let me first thank Paula-Anne Moore for bringing a parent perspective to this discussion. All of us are, the others of us are all educators. And to hear her bring that kind of perspective is very important to the delivery. So I want her to know that her comments are valued. The second thing is, having listened to my friend Yvette, you know, she raised some concerns, which I hope, Mr. Moderator and Mr. Chairman, through you, that we will raise with the Ministry of Education, with the government, as they set about talking about reform. We cannot, and we must not, allow the political directorate, even though they have the power and so on, to move ahead with what they call junior academies, middle school, and all these fancy names that they got from over and away, without understanding the implications for our society. We need to get through to them. And so a lot of this stuff that we are bringing up here, very important material coming up here, must reach the authorities. I hope you understand that. And Mr. Moderator, and the point which you raised, you cannot have education, meaningful educational reform, unless you ask the question, education for what? What kind of society are we trying to create? What is the philosophy of education that we are talking about? Then that will inform all of the changes that you're going to make. But I am afraid that in Barbados, we too often rush ahead and do things without understanding the implications. We haven't studied those implications. We just do things to show that we have done something. And then down the road, we discover that we've made some errors that are irreversible. And that we have to make sure we get this right. So I'm saying to you, Mr. Chair, I'm speaking to the President of BUT through you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Moderator. Our union must ensure that the government hears what we are saying. We are the practitioners, the ones who have to deal with the system and have to educate children. We are the ones who will also be blamed when things go wrong. You know that.
Yeah.
Right. So what is their philosophy of education? What is it that the government wants to achieve through any educational reform? Very important question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Goddard. Over to you, Mr. President. I see your hand.
Yes, Dr. Marshall. Thank you, Mr. Goddard. I just want to make it abundantly clear that the BUT is unaware of the objectives of the education reform that's being undertaken at this time. However, if you take a look back to the 1995 white paper on education reform, there were 11 objectives. Whether these objectives are still relevant is left to be seen, but we are not aware of the objectives of this education reform that's currently being implemented.
Mr. President, thanks for that. But I also think that what Mr. Goddard placed on the table is also food for thought, because again, as he quite rightly said, if we, based on what we are hearing and what we are seeing, the impression being communicated is that we will have, let us say, a consultation with, I suppose, with the teachers and the principals in let me say, in the next month or whatever the case might be. But the reality is that reform of this magnitude, or in fact, indeed, transformation of the magnitude that is being envisaged cannot be done if you're only going to have a one-day consultation with teachers or even with principals. This process can take you between 5 and 7 years, because you're talking about changing culture, and you don't change culture by legal edict. That is the fundamental point. And just the posture already tells us that that age-old practice is going to continue again. So we will be told, oh, we have consulted because you came and you had 1 meeting with us or 2 meetings with us. That is not the essence of when you're talking about educational reform. It goes way, way, way beyond that, because you are changing a culture, and you cannot change a culture by just a topical consultation. It takes years, even before you start to implement. The work involved is tremendous. And I want to support what Mr. Goddard said, that somebody just do things for the sake to say what we have done. And then we leave a trail of destruction. And nobody remembers, but oh, this was done in this era. But the students are the ones, and the teachers are the ones, and the parents are the ones who will suffer if there's any fallout. So the fundamental point must be made that consultation must not be a one-off thing. When we talk about educational change and transformation, as he said, it is a process. And I shudder to think that we are at this stage still where we think that you can only have a consultation 1 day or even 2 days with teachers, and that will suffice. It will not suffice, because all you are doing is simply trying to give the impression that you have done something when indeed you have done little or nothing. I'll open the floor to other comments. Yes, Ian Marshall, my name said. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. Now, we were going to run down this alley during our presentation. I'm glad you jumped the gun. No,
sorry.
No, it's okay, because we'll deal with it further. Now, I have some documents here. Curriculum 2000, and then there's the 2002 to 2012 strategic plan brought about by the then Minister of Education, Youth Affairs and Sports. And in this document, they speak about curriculum development. They speak about all these different things that we are talking about here today, and that we have spoken about 20 years ago. Now, I am no longer convinced that we are serious about education reform in Barbados. We have a white paper, green paper, all different kind of papers and all different colors. And we are basically warming over soup and talking about things just how we spoke about Nelson over and over and over and over, and did not get up and do what we needed to do, right? So I think that there is a sinister aim in keeping education as it is, right? And I think that the more we talk, the less we'll do.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Victor Hutchinson, I see your hand. You can go ahead.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, good evening.
Good evening.
I just wanted to say that I enjoyed those two presentations, which I thought had great compatibility between each other, because Mrs. Moore asked the critical question, which is, what are we seeking to achieve? What is it that we're trying to do? Because that is the essential question, because from that will flow the merit of whatever proposals come forward and whatever proposals survive. And in the case of Mrs. Simmons-Jemmott, she actually gave examples of efforts elsewhere that illustrate the failings that can occur. Because you remember Mrs. Moore talked about the potential destabilization of the system if you are confused about what you want to achieve or you're not clear. And Mrs. Simmons-Jemmott gave examples that actually illustrate that type of destabilization that led eventually to the abandonment of the system in Bermuda. So it seems to me that the union's response to this thing must be firm and must ask that type of question. And that your own comment is also very pertinent. That is that these past efforts at what they call consultation, it was not really consultation. It was more an opportunity to make speeches to select audiences. Because in these large meetings, there isn't great scope for back and forth that you can really, suss out an argument to a logical conclusion. Just a chance for a few people to get up and speak and the presenters to respond perhaps. So I think that the union has to insist on the types of questions posed by Mrs. Moore and Mrs. Simmons-Jemmott, that they be answered, and that they be answered not in any public setting where you're parading and performing, but rather in a small setting where a group perhaps emerging from this setup that the union has put together, a group that would therefore be informed, would be able to truly ventilate and truly react to whatever proposals the ministry may put, and put it from the perspective of research and deep analysis based on experience and also based on reading. So the bottom line is that I enjoyed those two presentations, which I thought, along with your comment, had a great compatibility between them.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hutchinson. Any more questions, any more comments to be made? I'm just scanning to see because I'm not seeing all my screens at one time. I see another hand. Let me just get that person to, I think I saw another hand just now. Yes, I recognize, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Kez Ama Selas. I hope I have that correctly. I do, but I apologize. You have the floor.
Thank you, brother moderator.
Okay, you're welcome.
Greetings. Greetings to the president of our great union, and to all other executive members, and to all the veterans like Mr. Goddard, and to the panelists. I just want to, my name is Amha Selassie Yacob, and Kes is my title. Kes meaning that I am, it's like reverend. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that information, sir.
You're welcome. I've heard, and I'm commending also Mr. Adams, my friend of years ago, Dr. Harris, who I'm meeting for the first time, I suppose, and Ms. Simmons-Jemmott, also my friend of years ago, and Ms. Moore, who is my friend of more recent time. And what I'm getting coming through a lot is that we have to look at the psychological effect. I think we are aware that the Ministry of Education has psychological services within which it supplies to the schools, to the education system. And I suppose they also have advice at that level. And I'm not sure that how they're being advised or if they're taking the advice on the psychological effect of these proposed changes, which you're calling reform, but I'm not ready to call reform yet. I'm gonna say briefly why I'm saying that. You see, we are in an era of we come and find something, we don't like it, instead of fixing what can be fixed, we tear down and build a fresh one all over again. I think that a lot of that is happening. So if we're looking at the psychological impact, Mr. Adams was at pains to indicate that there is damage. I think he used the word damage.
Yes.
And Mrs. Simmons-Jemmott used the word trauma. Also, Dr. Harris also touched on that matter. And the psychological impact and I suppose you could say damage to the children is something that we cannot treat it lightly. You see, the children are developing, and to have psychological damage while you are developing, that has very severe long-term effects. And I don't know what advice is being given to the Ministry of Education from inside it, or how they're dealing with the advice that comes. But I think our union should also take some steps to get good advice on the psychological impact and damage of these proposed changes, which call reform, and I'm not so sure are reform, but that's a different issue. I just want to highlight the psychological impact.
Thank you. We have 30 seconds. Anybody wants to make one last comment before we go to our last segment? 30 seconds. Who wants to weigh in on this? Make a comment. I'm searching through. I don't see any more hands raised. So I would go segue nicely then to our final segment, and I'm going to invite. This is going to be a dual presentation. I'm going to invite Ian Marshall and Tara Durant to begin their segment. And they're 6 minutes for either person. Ian and Tara, over to you.
Good night, everyone. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good evening, members of the media, colleagues in education, and wider members of the public. Tonight, our topic is Academies of Excellence and the implications for teachers. As Ian would have mentioned, a lot of this has come out already in the discussions, but we will go into this tonight. I'm presenting tonight with my colleague here, Ian Marshall. He's a graduate teacher and an avid trade unionist, and I am Tara Durant, and I am an executive member of the Barbados Union of Teachers. We have to admit that teachers are key stakeholders in any educational reform. And at this moment, teachers have not been consulted in this education reform process. And what we want to look at is, with the Academies of Excellence, how could this possibly impact our teachers? But what are Academies of Excellence? What do we know about it? What we know are the proposed changes are Academies of Excellence will be specialized, specialized areas, specific subjects that students can branch off into. That is the basic knowledge that we have. But what does that mean for our teachers? What does that mean for our educators? So at this point, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague, Mr. Ian Marshall, to deal with the first areas of concern.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. Once again, I'm going to jump straight into it. We're going to be looking at some very small aspects of in terms of the implications for teachers in the context of this whole reform idea. There are many more things that we have identified, but we're going to touch briefly on these. Funding. Funding is a word that has been bandied about for generations. And teachers at all levels of the system know that funding is inadequate in many areas. As of now, the Education Ministry is challenged to properly fund the schools in existence. So with additional resources and makeovers necessary and mooted, how will funding feature to adequately deal with these new introductions? We know that at the primary level, where a lot of the issues manifest there and later on balloon into larger issues, they are largely as a result of inadequate resources in terms of counselors, special needs teachers, psychologists, reading teachers, and so on. So it begs the question, how would funding feature into this whole, increased funding feature into this whole process? And without this funding, we'll just be issuing this warm over soup, rebranding without substance. Okay, the second point we're going to look at is infrastructure, which is and it deals a lot with the retrofitting of schools, because if we're talking about middle schools, special schools, at the upper echelon of the scales, particularly, you're talking about retrofitting the schools to meet the needs of the particular curriculum, which we'll look at in due course, that will have to come into place, equipment and so on, to retrofit the schools. And again, we're coming back to funding. So retrofitting of institutions will have to occur in order to make way for the various changes expected. So besides, as I said, being a monetary issue, the issue is how this affects productivity. Without the requisite infrastructure in place, how is this going to factor into the equation? So there'll be considerable alterations to be made with the system. And you know, again, it's beyond my comprehension how we are going to do this without affecting the smooth running of the institutions in general. All right, Tara, we'll look at the disruption in the schools.
So with infrastructural changes, obviously will come disruption. There will be physical disruption, obviously. So the infrastructures will need to be ready to accommodate students and teachers. This development will cause anxiety. It can cause disorientation and even depression. We've heard about transitioning for students and what things we have in place for them, but what do we have in place for the transitions of teachers? For teachers, you're asking them to go to a completely new system of teaching, a new structure, and a new physical structures as well. So there will be a physical disruption. There'll also be a psychological impact associated with this change. You'll have teachers that may have to leave schools, as was alluded to earlier, because if a school becomes a middle school and there are teachers there who have the qualifications for an academy of excellence, there would obviously be some sort of relocations. So teachers may have to leave schools that they've been into several years to adjust to a different culture and way of teaching and learning. That will have a psychological impact. How will we deal with our teachers? We speak of our students, but how are we going to deal with the psychological impact on our teachers? These physical plans, the adjustments will be made to times, furniture, work spaces, rooms, and the introduction of new curricula, which we will touch on to meet modern needs. We have a question: when and how will this be done? Because education reform is a long process. Will teacher overload and burnout be considered? Will these changes be implemented in such a way that teachers do not feel overwhelmed? For instance, in other territories, professional development is actually built into the timetable. So during the week, there's professional development. So that means that training is always ongoing. Is that what we are going to seek to do? Or will it be a situation like with remote learning, where teachers were, when we went into the COVID situation, where teachers were being trained while also delivering instruction? Will we overload our teachers and leave work-life balance I have no work-life balance. So the concern is that disruption. When and how will this be done? And will teachers and the workload be considered in this process? Because if teachers are bombarded with sweeping changes, remember that teachers are major stakeholder, they're big human capital. Their lack of preparation will have a negative impact on the quality of schoolwork. Without teachers being adequately trained and adequately prepared, this education reform will fail. Ian?
Okay, curriculum reform is another area that has to be taken into consideration. Now, with reforming of the whole system, with the move towards specialist institutions, curriculum reform has to be at the forefront of any reform within the education context of Barbados. So there will be a need to retrain teachers to carry out the curriculum changes. How and when will it be done? We have serious issues with the training institution right now at Edison. How are we going to effect a particular training strategy that will allow the teachers to be trained en masse within this present dispensation? What will replace the BSSEE, what we commonly refer to as the common entrance? That again is part of curriculum reform. How are we going to use the transition system, whatever it is, to allow the students to move from point A to point B? How will this additional workload impact the teaching fraternity? Because there will be additional workload. And with an additional workload, there will be, in some areas, a superannuation of teachers. There are teachers who, for some reason, will not be able to cope, and they will become obsolete within the whole process. And as well, in curriculum reform, when we're talking about curriculum reform, we're talking about additional workload, and with additional workload, there must be adequate remunerative rewards.
But before we get to that, this comes from the then Ministry of Education Strategic Plan from 2002 to 2012. It speaks to the successful delivery of quality education in Barbados is dependent on a well-trained and qualified teaching staff. So we're talking about retraining. But in this retraining, there's something that has not been addressed. What about special education? In June 1994, 92 governments and 25 international organizations formed the World Conference on Special Needs Education. And it was agreed that inclusion should become the norm. To date, inclusion is not the norm in Barbados. When we are talking about education reform, will all teachers now be trained in special needs? Are we moving towards full inclusion? Or will special units be placed in academies of excellence? Just how are we including special education in this education reform? They must and should be included. And when we're talking about this extra training, whether we're moving towards inclusion, whether we are giving specialized training because the academies of excellence will focus on specific areas, and we're going to go through a massive retraining of teachers, are they going to be compensated for all of this extra work? Again, from the strategic plan, the government of Barbados needs to begin to view the educational sector as a productive sector, since it's principally responsible for the development of the country's primary natural resource, its human resources. So teachers are responsible for the country's primary national resource. Should they not be compensated for that? In this process, we can envisage that there will be an arise for need for retraining, upgrading of qualifications. There may need to be retraining right across the board, depending on how these changes are implemented. And that should necessitate salary adjustments. And in terms of those salary adjustments, other territories, there's a strategic partnership with the business sector so that when they choose specialized subjects, that those students will come out and directly benefit the economy. Is that what we're going to look to do so that therefore the further investment, the further funding that would go into the academies of excellence would be cost effective to the government? What are we going to do in terms of that? Teachers should be compensated for their time and for their efforts. Because if you're saying that you're going to have a specialist school, they need to have specialist qualifications, specialist training. It is a different area altogether, and we should have salary adjustments. Then, of course, one of the big reasons that a lot of people are talking about getting rid of the Barbados secondary school entrance exam is the stigma it carries if you do not make it into one of those top schools. In this education reform process, as this transition from primary to secondary level prepares to undergo change, the lingering question is whether these changes will eliminate the notion of good school and bad school that presently accompany the BSSEE. What are we replacing the BSSEE with? Are we doing continuous assessment? Are we simply placing students into middle schools? Are we renaming the schools, as was mentioned before, to take away from that stigma? Or will we simply just be moving this stigma to academies of excellence? Because now academies of excellence will focus on certain subjects. And will certain subjects now be deemed the good schools and certain subjects be deemed the bad schools? How will we address stigma and discrimination in this process of education reform? And will we leave teachers in the same schools as well? Because some teachers who are teaching at the so-called good schools might not want to be moved to a school that they think is a bad school. So what are we going to do to take away from the stigma and discrimination in this process of education reform? So that was our brief points that we decided to touch on due to time limits, like time constraints. And at this time, we invite you to ask any questions or offer any comments that you may have about what we have just presented. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Ian, and thank you, Tara. And as she quite rightly said, brief, succinct, but very to the point. And I invite the questions at this time. Question time. Okay, I am looking at my screens. I don't see a raised hand. I'm just going to ask, say that, let me just go back to the screen again.
Mr. Goddard
I
has
see
his hand raised.
Yes, Mr. Goddard, I was just scrolling through the screens. Yes, Mr. Goddard, you can go.
I'm going first this time because I have to go very shortly.
Okay, that is quite all right.
I am hoping that based on what I'm hearing, especially the last two presentations, I'm hoping that we as a teaching fraternity do not accept that any alternative to the common entrance exam will necessity be this question of this business of middle school and junior academies. Because I can think of an effective alternative which could be pursued, and it doesn't include any middle school and junior academy. See, if we go down that road, all we would need to do in order to retain the common entrance exam is to debunk the whole idea of middle school and junior academy. Once we successfully do that, then we say, well, you see, there's no alternative. Let us hold on to the common entrance exam. I am saying that the middle school, the concept of middle school and junior academy is not one that Barbados should even begin to entertain. That we need to look to see what we need to do to get rid of the stigma that we talk about, to make sure that our children are given the best chance of developing their potential. That's what we need to make sure we do. And that the philosophy which we develop for education and the kind of society we want to create must inform what we do. So I don't want us at all to accept, and I fear sometimes that I'm getting that coming through, that we accept the government, we are buying what the government is offering for sale, this business of middle school and junior academy. I really hope that is not what we're doing. I hope that this union does not go down that road. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Goddard. I see Kez has his hand. I'll ask you to comment at this time. Then we're going to go
Thank-
to final comments from all the presenters. You can go.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I'm wondering if the team of Marshall and Durant are aware, having mentioned the special education or special needs, are aware that Barbados is signatory to the convention, I don't remember the exact name of it, having to do with the rights of persons with disabilities, and there's actually a committee that is supposed to be in place to make sure that Barbados is doing what it ought to do or committed to do in relation to that convention. And I'm thinking that that convention has to address the matter of special needs education. I was within the committee at some time. I don't know what's happening now, and especially now that there's a commission which takes it to a different level altogether to deal with persons with disabilities. So I'm just wondering if, in your concerns about special needs and special education, if you're taking that also into account, that Barbados is committed to do certain things which must be implemented even through the Ministry of Education in relation to special education and special needs.
Well, Kez, I know that, and as Tara had mentioned, the 1994 Salamanca Convention has been, Barbados has been a signatory to it, but I'm not sure, because the Education Act has not been changed to reflect this in turn, because we're still talking in the Act about special schools. Sorry, special needs schools. When the Salamanca Convention refers to inclusion, right? I know it has been done on a piecemeal basis, but I'm not thoroughly, I am speaking subject to correction. I do not think that it has been ratified to reflect that convention.
Just let me weigh here quickly, Ian, and the reality is that it has been ratified, but the problem is that when you sign on to conventions, there is the enabling environment that must go along with that. So you can sign a convention, but if you don't put the other things in place to ensure, for example, that you observe what is called the least restrictive principle, which speaks to the idea that you include people within the classroom in a manner that does not separate the persons who are disabled from those who are able, so to speak. So you are right in that they have signed the convention, but remember there's always the implementation deficit, which was alluded to a bit earlier. So they have signed, but we know that if you don't have a very vibrant lobby to ensure that certain things happen within the country, or you don't have the subsidiary legislation that is also required to create a framework within which you can unpack or operationalize something like the inclusive model, then you have a challenge, and that is where we are right now. So I'm going to invite Mr. Adams to do his closing remarks. Mr. Adams, please go ahead. I think you are still muted, Mr. Adams. Are you hearing me?
I'm hearing you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm hearing you fine right now.
Yes.
So your closing remarks.
Yes, I want to take the opportunity to thank all the presenters and of course those persons who made comments and asked questions.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was extremely informative.
Mm-hmm.
And I really will take time to reflect on something that I want to say, because I don't want to say it too early. However, though, we need to recognize that the children of this country have actually given their opinion to two high-powered commissions. And it is my belief that it is the inputs of those, the comments of those students that have catapulted the authorities into coming to the conclusion that they would have reform. However, reform is not a footloose policy, and something like education reform, I think I mentioned it's more a second or third area change, they'll require a tremendous amount of work. And I'm not picking on the primary school, but I think that we need to get the primary school right. It will take 2 or 3 years to get the primary school right. And if we can get the primary school right and have children moving into the secondary schools, I'm not going into the discussion of academies and so on. We have a network of schools in this country already, and there's absolutely no reason why children should not go to school where they live. Absolutely no reason. The only reason why that is not so is because the so-called good schools are literally owned by the middle class, and other people are brainwashed to believe that they really have a chance of getting there. But those people who were to study this situation very closely would find that you're not finding it's worse now than in the 1950s. Let me say right now that I am the product of a cane cutter and a maid or a servant, they didn't call maids in those days. And I went to school barefooted. The likes of me and others like me who went to college in Paris in the 1950s are not getting into those schools now. It is a very serious thing, and it is reflecting in the social dislocation of the country. And indeed, it is directly related to the economic decline. So the education has to look and integrate itself into the economic plan of the country. And the idea of discussing education by itself and middle school and all that sort of thing is, in this day and age, is an exercise in futility. And I believe that we need to set some markers, some targets, marshal our forces and so on. And the idea that the mental capacity that we have in this country could not come up with a good plan to reform a system that is moribund. It's just a joke that we have the know-how here to be able to reform this system for the betterment of the students and the social and economic upliftment of this country. And that is where the discussion should go.
Thank you, Mr. Adams. Well said. Dr. Harris, your final comments.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. I would want to agree with Mr. Adams that there needs to be some work done with regard to the primary schools. But I would also want to add that within the primary schools, there isn't much that principals and teachers can do unless the Ministry of Education responds to their needs, because they operate under the ambit of the Ministry of Education directly, unlike the secondary school. Now, this evening, my presentation dealt specifically with the implications of the abolition of the common entrance exam.
It's very good.
Especially for students, teachers, and principals. I would also want to say that these particular stakeholders, along with the parents, of course, are critical in the entire scenario. I would want to emphasize the point that any new assessment that is introduced must respond to the current distress that our children encounter whenever they have to write the common entrance examination.
I agree.
Any new assessment must give attention to the needs of the students. So the data that emerges from the assessment must be used to address the students' needs, so that as they move from one level to another, they are not simply failing over and over again. We have to address their needs with the aim of helping them to find their niche and to improve. I would also want to say that any new assessment approach that is implemented ought to be one that removes the high level of commercialism that is currently associated with the common entrance exam.
Yeah.
And when I talk about commercialism, I am not necessarily speaking about what happens with the businesses in the private sector, but I'm talking about how parents, teachers, Ministry of Education officials respond when this exam is on the doorstep. We hear the comparisons from school to school. And then at the end of the exam, when the results are revealed, we hear the comparisons from student to student. And I believe that this needs to be eradicated, or it needs to be reduced, and the focus needs to be more on helping our students to be better able to be productive citizens in this nation. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's very well said.
Dr. Harris, yes. And can I have Yvette Simmons-Jemmott? It's your turn. Please give your closing remarks.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Marshall. You mentioned that true reform, which must of necessity include collaboration with stakeholders, would take about 7 years. And I agree with you. And when you look at this proposed reform, which will require a complete dismantling of the secondary system, the idea of doing it the way we seem to be committed to doing it is, I think, foolhardy, if not ludicrous. I really can't say much more than that.
Yes, well said, Simmons-Jemmott. Over to you, Paula-Anne Moore. Your final comments. You're still muted. Oh, great.
I'll get there in the end. I just want to thank fellow committee members, the general public and the media for coming out. I just want to reiterate that we're all in this together. Education is too vital aspect of our society for us to get wrong. Barbados has a heritage, for better or for worse. We haven't done everything right, obviously, but we have a huge middle class relative to other CARICOM members and even the rest of the world, largely based on education being used as a ladder for socioeconomic development and personal enhancement. And education reform is needed. I just want to make sure that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, and that we can ensure that children who are academically gifted can maximize their ability and potential, while also ensuring that children who may not be as academically gifted have the means by which they can improve themselves as well academically, as well as maximize any other attributes that they have. And I think what is important is that stakeholder engagement, which is what we're all saying, materializes, and true engagement. And it also, what has come through out of these two stakeholder meetings is that communication is essential. We need optimal communication from the ground up to ensure that we get what we are trying to achieve out of education reform. So I thank you again for the opportunity, and I look forward to further collaboration with all the stakeholders involved. Thank you, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you. Ian, your turn.
Okay, now I'm going to be brief. I don't want the public to believe that this is a reactionary affair going on here, because we do have a plan. We do have our own conception of what education reform should look like, but we are picking the system apart because the model that has been presented to us is not, in our opinion, a fair model that we need to go forward with. Now, I believe in real change. I'm not a gradualist. I believe that if you're going to do something, you do it. And you don't just keep talking about it and spinning top in mud, going wrong in circles. That is not my approach. I don't believe in cosmetics. I believe that if we want a reform which is wide-ranging, that reform should be based on substance and not talk and paper, and that will, all these different reports and things that will just catch dust at the end of the day. I believe that we have to disband our aristocracy at the top and deploy those resources at the lower level where they are needed. Teachers complain for years about things that are happening in the system that are wrong. Teachers are one of the only professions I know that are not given the remuneration at the master's level for qualifications. And we constantly are having work on top of work dumped on us repeatedly, and we are not being remunerated for it. We said that education has the highest portion of GDP, 6.5% or something like that. But where is that money going? That money is not going to the teachers to provide resources at the bottom of the ladder. That is what we want. We want real change, not cosmetic change. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Yes, Tara, your view, final comment.
As Ian would have said, change is necessary. The only constant in life is change, and education must change to suit the demands of our current society. But seeing that our presentation today looked at educators, I just simply wish to say that to first address any necessary changes in education, you must consult with the educators. Educators must be a key part of the process. To find out what the key needs and deficiencies, you need to talk to the personnel who are dealing with the student populace on a daily basis. Major changes, education reform should not be done quickly and without consultation with the major stakeholders, with the major stakeholders obviously including teachers. So that is just briefly what I want to say, because everybody would have gone through the entire gamut, and that's what I want to say. And thank you very much for coming out tonight to this town hall meeting.
Thank you, Tara. And I just want to say my final comment would be, as just to underscore a lot of what was said before, and I think the most salient point is that reform is not a quick fix. In fact, the latest research is suggesting that we should actually be engaging in transformation rather than reformation. And the second point I want to leave on the table as well is that we need to understand that the process of changing a culture is time sensitive, in the sense that, in other words, it's time intensive. There are no quick fixes. And we have to debunk that idea that we can put a timeline like 2 years. 2 years is woefully inadequate to do any type of fundamental change, or rather the type of fundamental change that is required for this educational system. And because we are starting on that premise, I think we are in for a very bumpy ride. Mr. President, I hand over to you at this time to make your final comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marshall. This has truly been a thought-provoking conversation. While it is a belief that stakeholders are being included after the fact, I, like most of my colleagues, firmly believe that reform should come from action research done by teachers or practitioners in the classroom. One must also note that regardless of if the common interest is here next year or the year after, the foundation of the education system needs to be strengthened. Resources need to be readily available. Curriculum reform shall also be high on the agenda of any education reform. Also, the educational interests of students should be paramount. Please note that when this committee started in February this year, we had as our mission the development of a presentation paper for the Ministry of Education. We had decided that we were going to do 3 town hall meetings, 1 with teachers and 2 with the general public. We were unable to do.
You're breaking up, Mr. President. Mr. President,
Okay.
You're breaking up very badly.
Okay, you can hear me now? No, I was saying that when we started in February.
I hear you a bit better now.
Right, our intention was to develop a presentation paper to be placed before the Ministry of Education. We wanted to have 3 meetings, 1 with teachers and 2 with stakeholders. At this point of time in the term, we were unable to meet with teachers given the fact that they would have been busy attending to their duties, common entrance, CXC, et cetera, et cetera. So our next meeting, town hall meeting will be with teachers. And after that, we will get working on our presentation paper, which we will be taking to the Ministry of Education. But I want to take the opportunity to thank all those who came out tonight. And please continue to support the Barbados Union of Teachers as we are trying to put the interests of the general student population and teachers at heart. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you to all the presenters. Thank you for all the members of the audience. And thank you for those who raised concerns and made comments. All is left for me to do is to wish you a very enjoyable rest of the evenings. Thank you. Good evening.